All right, so good morning, everyone. For those that are watching the video, I'm Dr. John Saunders from the Communication Arts Department, and this is my class on public memory and race in the South. And today we have Dr. Dave Tell with us. He's professor of communication studies at the University of Kansas, co-director of the Emmett Till Memory Project, and the author of one of our textbooks, Remembering Emmett Till, and has been a good friend of mine since grad school, where when we were both at Penn State. So with that, Dr. Tell, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, John. Good to be with you all. Thanks for the invitation. John, thanks to the other 17 of you or 16 of you, whatever there are here, for reading the book, or at least reading parts of it, or the Cliff Notes, or whatever you do in college these days. Appreciate that. I love the class topic too. I got to say, memory, race, and the South. These are the precise things I've been thinking about for the last 7 years, things that sort of predate my work with the Emmett Till Memorial Commission and postdate the publication of my book. The sort of memory, race, South are kind of like the master terms of my research over the last 7-8 years. And so I'm jealous of the course. If I was in Huntsville, I would be sitting and taking this course alongside y'all. Gotta say, it's an honor to be with you. I have spoken to people, coast to coast. I've told these stories in jails, in high schools, in middle schools, in detention centers, in town halls, in libraries, in community colleges, and at elite universities. But without fail, I enjoy telling these stories most, and the experiences are the most rewarding when I get to do it in the South, where of course, race is not sort of confined to the South by any stretch of the imagination. But these stories are a little dearer and a little nearer in the South. And so it's a pleasure to be with you. As I was chatting with John just beforehand, I was in Jackson, Mississippi for the last week, doing research on, of all things, race, memory in the American South. Or that was the plan. Got snowed in. The roads, as you know, I imagine Huntsville had some weather also. So I ended up just being in Jackson rather than doing research in Jackson for the last week. But in any case, great to be with you. I have never been to Huntsville, and look forward to being able to get out there at some point. But I'm coming to you today from my home in Lawrence, Kansas, where it's also snowy and cold, although less so than it was last week.
Well, and if you ever do want to come to the Scottsboro Museum, that's not too far away from here.
I want to come. I was just looking at the map. I mean, Oxford, I spent a lot of time in Oxford, Mississippi, just because that's a lot of, I don't know if you've read chapter 3 of the book yet, but that chapter was built on the archives in Oxford. And I'm going back, I'll probably be back in Oxford twice in the next 4 or 5 months. And I noticed you guys are pretty close, so maybe I can come over sometime. Let's see. Now, most of the time I tell these stories, truth be told, I tell these stories to audiences who have not read the book. And so you guys are sort of a more educated, you know my stories already. And so what I'm going to do this time is I can tell you, I'll start with maybe 10 to 15 minutes of background information and of how I got into the project. I can tell you a little bit about how I found some of the archives. And then I'll pause and I'll sort of, after my sort of long introduction, I'll pause for questions you might have, either about things I've said in the introduction or about things that have come up in your reading of the book or your discussion of the book in class. And we'll see where that goes. And then following some Q&A, I'm happy to tell some stories from the book with a little more images and pictures and context than you might get in the book. So we'll just see where time takes us. Does that sound okay, John?
Sounds perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen here. You guys see a quotation from MLK? Oops. All right, I like to start with this quotation because it's MLK. You know, people love themselves some MLK, but it's language that will sound very familiar to you, and it's also the quotation at the very front of the book. It says, "I have a dream this afternoon that there will be a day that we no longer face the atrocities that Emmett Till had to face or Medgar Evers had to face." And I hope some of this quotation looks familiar to you. I'm sure the "I have a dream" language sounds familiar. But I have a hunch also that part of this quotation seems unfamiliar. I hope it sort of strikes you as odd that you see the names of Emmett Till and Medgar Evers, killed 1955 and 1963 respectively, in the speech from Dr. King, right? And that's because this is not the "I have a dream" speech that you think you know. This is not the famous March on Washington "I have a dream" speech. This is what we might think of as King's trial run of the "I have a dream" conceit. This was June 1963. This was in Detroit. It was one of the largest civil rights rallies in the North to date. And King gave the "I have a dream" speech, and it worked so well that what would it be, 2 months, 3 months later, in August of 63, when King was in DC on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he gave the "I have a dream" speech a second time. And it worked really well. As you know, it worked so well, it became the most famous speech, if not the most famous document in the entire civil rights movement. I mean, my kids learned this speech in second grade. It might be one of the most famous speeches in American history. Forget famous speeches of the movement. But a second thing happened. The moment when King made the speech famous in DC on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the reference to Emmett Till was cut. So in the same moment that this speech became the defining document of the civil rights movement, Emmett Till lost his place in that document. Now, I don't imagine that King cut Emmett Till intentionally. I like to think of the "I have a dream" speech as kind of like a jazz performance. You know, it's a little bit different every time. But intentional or not, the erasure of Emmett Till from the official text of the civil rights movement proved all too prophetic, because get this, and this is kind of one of the launching points of my book, one of the realizations that set things in motion for me. Till's story was never well told. In fact, if you start with the murder in August of 1955, you have to go 49 years and 11 months before the state of Mississippi dropped a single dollar on Emmett Till commemoration. That's nearly 50 years of official silence on the murder. And I mean, you guys are in Alabama, you know, I mean, I'm pretty confident you guys have seen a lot of civil rights commemoration in Birmingham, Montgomery. I'm sure Huntsville has it also. And you know that civil rights commemoration came to Alabama, Georgia, and other sites of the SCLC. We're talking like 80s. We're talking 25, 30 years before Mississippi started spending money on Emmett Till. So it was a long time, even by the sort of impossibly slow standard of civil rights commemoration. The 50 years is a long time. And when commemoration did come, it was challenged very publicly and very dramatically. It was plagued by ongoing issues of vandalism. And here I just want to walk you through some slides of some of the first efforts to commemorate the story of Till's murder in Mississippi. So this is actually this sign, the Emmett Till Memorial Highway. This is the sign that was dedicated on July 1st, 2005. And when I say the state took 49 years and 11 months to drop $1 on Till commemoration, it was this sign that kind of marks their first investment in Till commemoration. And as you can see, it only stood a couple months before it was vandalized with spray painted letters, the spray painted letters KKK. Here's a sign. This sign went up in 2011. This sign stands in front of Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. This sign marks the place where Till whistled. If you could read the fine print, this sign would say that you are standing at ground zero of the civil rights movement, which is a contested claim, especially in Alabama. But in Mississippi, people like to think that the movement started here at Bryant's Grocery. And this is what happened to it in the summer of 2017. It was defaced with acid. The same morning it was defaced, a school group came through from St. Louis, and this is one of my favorite pictures. Voila, they took memory into their own hands. They refused to let the vandals have the last word, and they took it upon themselves to tell Till's story. I think this is a really cool snapshot of memory in action right here. Of course, if you've seen anything in the news about Emmett Till vandalism, you've probably seen signs that look like this. And I'm putting like this is the sketch that the Emmett Till Memorial Commission drew up when they commissioned the first 8 signs to be placed along roadsides in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. And I'm putting up this design sketch that I discovered in the archives of the Memorial Commission, because it's the only picture I have of an unvandalized sign that marks the spot where Till's body was pulled from the river, because otherwise the first picture I have of it looks like that. It's already been stolen. Like, this is how quickly vandalism came, right? I don't even have a picture of the sort of original unvandalized sign. The gentleman in the blue coat and white hat in the back corner there is a man named Jerome Little. He's the founder of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission. He's a local hero in Tallahatchie County, and he's done more for Till's memory than pretty much anyone else. And you can tell here they're gathered. The sheriff has just left the scene, and the sheriff told them that this sign was stolen, and based on the tire tracks that kind of head back behind them, the sheriff concluded that this sign was thrown into the river at the same spot where Till's body was pulled from the water. Jerome Little was very controversial when this sign was, he told a reporter out at the site right on this day, he's like, this was done by white people. And it's because they don't like Black stories being told publicly. And that caused a minor brouhaha in the local papers. He was asked to resign, but refused. And instead, he just replaced the sign. So he put the sign immediately back up in 2008. That's what it looks like. This picture is from 2013. You can tell it accumulated a number of bullet holes. It accumulated precisely, I think, 167 bullet holes. We took it to a ballistics outfit down in Jackson to count them. We took it down in the fall of 2016, so you get the empty posts there. I actually love this picture of the empty posts as a memory image. Then you get a new one. This is summer 2018. If you're counting, this is sign number 3 at this spot. The first one was stolen and thrown in the river. The second one was filled with bullet holes and cut down. You can see the empty posts still standing there. These are the people standing, if you can see my mouse, dedicating the sign right here. These are representatives of the Mississippi State Legislature. The woman is a woman named Miss Washington. I'm blanking on the name of the gentleman at the moment, but what I want to focus on is how long this sign stood before it too was filled with bullet holes. And the answer is 37 days. It took 37 days before this sign was shot up. That takes us to the summer of 2019. You may have seen this. The legendary investigative reporter out of Jackson, Jerry Mitchell. His book Race Against Time just came out. It's a great memory studies book. Jerry Mitchell broke this photograph in July of 2019. It's a photograph of 3 fraternity brothers from the University of Mississippi posed with an assault rifle and a hunting rifle in front of the shot up sign. Clearly, I think it's obvious that they are glorying in the destruction of the sign. They're posed in front of it as they might stand posed with a 12-point buck, right? Their weapons are visible, their faces are smiling, and their sort of capture is right center in the image. Just for the record, so you know, when Jerry Mitchell broke the story, he published the names of these 3 students. He published their high schools. There's no mystery who these kids are. And the police have never opened an investigation against them. And if you will, sort of hold that fact side by side with this one. And I don't have a picture of this on hand. You can easily look it up on the internet. But in the spring and summer, early summer of 2020, just before the Confederate statue at the front of the University of Mississippi campus was moved, it too was vandalized, but it was vandalized by a student from the left. It was spray painted. I don't remember what the exact words were, but it was spray painted something along the lines of, "This Confederate monument is a testament to white supremacy." It took the police about 3 minutes to respond and arrest the vandalist of that marker, right? He was arrested literally while he still had paint on his hands. And although the names of these 3 boys were published in the local paper, they were published in the USA Today, for crying out loud. A police investigation has never been opened against them. So you see a little bit of the double standard about when it comes to policing and protecting memorials, at least as far as this example suggests. Memorials to white America are protected by the force of the police, while memorials to Black America are allowed to be vandalized. And let's be clear what the vandalism does, and I think you can see this, right? If you can imagine the pristine memorial you see here as a monument to the stories of Black America, right? It's in public and it's giving dignity to a Black American story. Is it not clear that what happens when the signs are vandalized is that monument to Black stories becomes a monument to white supremacy, right? I think of, and this is a bit controversial at times, but since it's just the 17 of us, I'll go ahead and say it. At times, I have thought of these shot up signs as analogous to the burning crosses of the Klan, right? In that they are sort of visible markers of white supremacy. And they, in both cases, foreshadow and enact the violence that sustains white supremacy. Oops, going the wrong way, sorry. I love this site. This is fall of 2019. You were on the university campus. You can see the still standing, unvandalized Confederate statue in the background. This was a sort of all-out shop that I helped to host University of Mississippi campus, Race and Memory. Excuse me. And we brought this sign as a sort of show and tell piece for the students in Oxford. And you can see here 2 members of the student government at the University of Mississippi. This was following our meeting. This was of their own initiative. They carried the sign out to the Confederate monument, leaned it up against it, and just stood there in a beautiful enactment of nonviolent social protest. You know how long the police let them stand in front of the monument? They weren't doing anything. They weren't protesting. They weren't talking. There was no posters. They were simply standing in front of the monument with their sign. The police let them stand there precisely 5 minutes before they forcibly removed them and the sign from the Confederate monument. to my mind, another example of the ways in which the markers of white America are protected by the force of law, where the markers of Black America are left to fend for their own devices, which gives sort of a new edge to the topic of your class, right? Race and memory, right? Memory work is not evenly distributed, for sure. One of the things I did manage to see in Jackson this last week when I was stuck there during the snowstorm, at the end of the week, we were able to get down to Jackson State. And among other things, the campus of Jackson State is remarkable because it has 2 statues cast in granite to African Americans. You know how rare that is? They were the first statues in granite that ever seen in public in the South, right? Like every street corner has a monument to a white person. There's hardly any to Black people. And when we start to put up these Emmett Till signs, what we're trying to do is ever so slowly shift the balance of power, right? So that the stories we tell and the stories we dignify in public begin to match the experience of Black Americans as well as white Americans. Okay, a couple quick responses here. So first, the vandalism is how I got involved, okay? So I need to sort of give you some longer context on the book here. Back when John and I were at Penn State in the early 2000s, we were both writing dissertations. He about the politics of children's literature and myself about the politics of public confession. And all the way back then, one of the chapters of my dissertation was about the so-called confession to the murder of Emmett Till. That's what got me started. I tell that story a little bit in the Sunflower County chapter of the book. That chapter's got to start way back when John and I were at Penn State. But you know, that was early 2000s. I had published that particular story in a couple different places, and I thought I was done with the Till story. But in the summer of 2014, the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, which is a nonprofit in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, is composed of 9 white people and 9 Black people. They were getting so frustrated by the vandalism that they called a sort of 3-day summit. And the topic of the summit was like how to tell Till's story in the context of ongoing vandalism. And honestly, I just got lucky. It just so happened that my essay on the Look magazine Confession had been circulating among activists in the Delta at the precise time that the director of the nonprofit was calling this meeting. And so I got a phone call inviting me to come down to Mississippi and be a part of this meeting. I said no the first couple of times, actually, because I thought I was writing on architecture. I thought I was done with Emmett Till and race and memory. But I'm so grateful that friends prevailed upon me, and I went down and I spent 3 days in Tallahatchie County and in the Mississippi Delta. At the meeting, it was myself and some members of the nonprofit. Members of the Till family were there. Simeon Wright was there. He's the late departed uncle of Emmett Till. He was sharing a bed with Till the night he was abducted. The FBI was there and a couple funders were there. And I tell you, that trip humbled me. I remember being on the airplane, flying down there in the summer of 2014, thinking to myself, and please don't tell anyone I said this, thinking to myself, you know what, I'm going to know more about this story than any of these people down there because I've been writing about it. At that point, I've been writing about it for 10 years. Like I knew the story, or thought I did, backwards and forwards. But 2 things happened. The first thing was an intellectual humbling. I was driving through the Delta one afternoon with a historian named Devery Anderson and an FBI agent named Dale Killinger. Dale was the guy who reopened the case in 2004 and prosecuted it before a grand jury in February of 2006. And let me tell you, Dale and Devery knew so much more about the murder than I did, that if I didn't know they were talking about Emmett Till, I wouldn't have even been able to tell the topic of the conversation. So sort of being on site, like really sort of kind of blew me away. I'm like, wow, there's a lot more to this story than I thought there was. And so if like I was intellectually humbled, I was also, I don't know what the word here is, but I was just sort of like affectively humbled. And here I'm thinking about standing in front of Bryant's Grocery in early August 2014, listening to Simeon Wright tell the story of what he remembers from when Emmett Till whistled at the on the spot in which we were standing, and hearing the story of Till's kidnapping and murder from a family member and eyewitness who was there. It was like, again, like this part like wasn't intellectually news to me. I knew the facts of the story, but it was emotionally overwhelming. And immediately after that talk, immediately after Simeon told me that story, all of us gathered next door in what was then to me a building. It was the gas station that I talk about. What's it called? It's right next to Bryant's Grocery. I can't believe I'm blanking on the name, but we went in that gas station and we had a talk. And at the end of it, we were talking about the idea of making a smartphone app, you know, and the idea was very simple. If people can shoot a roadside marker, it's a lot harder to shoot an app. And the executive director of the commission said, you know what? Who's going to help me? And I'm not being humble here when I say I was easily the least qualified person in that room. That room had FBI agents, historians, and family members. They did not need me. But I was the only one who raised my hand. And that started a journey that would really transform my professional life, transform the entirety of my life over the following 6-7 years. The plan for the memory project started very small. We're going to make a smartphone app with 5 sites. Very early on, Google got involved for a hot second, and Google offered to build us a prototype, which we needed, but they said we needed 50 sites. And so in the summer of 2015, I flew back down to the Delta. I rented a car and spent 2 weeks with the executive director of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission. And this was our mission. They're like, we need a prototype for our app. Google will make us one for free if we have 50 sites. So let's just drive until we get 50 sites. And that's what we did. And a couple things happened. First of all, we got our prototype. It sucked. It's gone. You can no longer look at it. I won't show it to you because there's something better now. But more importantly, my friendship with Patrick Weems, who's the executive director, was solidified on that trip. And also, it was on that trip where we started going into all these towns like Money, Mississippi, and Sunflower County, and Drew, Mississippi. And you'll read about it at some point, Glendora, Mississippi. And I started hearing stories about the Till murder I had never heard before. And this blew me away because at this point, I'd been writing about it for like 12 or 13 years. But these stories were not about the murder itself. They were stories about how people who lived in its shadow were dealing with the murder, how they were trying to capitalize off the murder or change the story or bend the story. And so that's what my book is about. My book is not one more telling of the murder. Like there's plenty of those and there's good ones. I recommend Chris Benson. But my book is the only book that's really not about the murder itself. It's about the stories of the murder and the way those stories have changed over time. And all of those stories had their origin in that 14-day rental car tour of the Delta with my friend Patrick, where we were hunting sites for the Emmett Till Memory Project. Let me pause here for a quick plug. If you have not downloaded the Emmett Till Memory Project, would you do it? Like every download, even if you delete it later, every download helps us get another grant. I checked about a week ago, we're at about 2,500 downloads, which is profoundly okay. I have a lot of other usage statistics I could share with you if that kind of thing interests you. So feel free to ask about that. The other thing I'll share with you is at the same time we launched the app, we also put up the country's only, as far as I know, bulletproof sign. And this is not because we thought a bulletproof sign would solve the problem. In fact, in some ways, it just seems like a bigger target. But there was a big-hearted sign maker in Brooklyn, New York, who volunteered to fabricate, design, ship and install a bulletproof marker free of charge. All told, I mean, this is a $12,000, 500-pound sign, right? And no one on the commission thought it would solve anything, but also no one on the commission was about to turn down a $12,000 gift. So at the same time the app launched, this is late summer, early fall of 2019. We also dedicated this bulletproof sign. There's just some pictures of its fabrication up in Brooklyn. There it is. That's the bulletproof sign installed. I love the picture. You can see in the background the old posts from the old shot up sign. You can see right here, if you can see my little mouse, that's a motion activated security camera. There's also 2 of those mounted on nearby trees. You can also see there's Wheeler Parker. He's the last remaining eyewitness. He's speaking at the dedication. That's me speaking at the dedication. And this was about 2 weeks after the dedication. Our security cameras caught the League of the South. It's a white supremacist group using our bulletproof sign as a sort of staging ground for their own publicity stunt. Okay, so let me pause here. So this is the background of how I got involved, right? It started with the sort of grad school. It was provoked by the vandalism. And then I have this screen here. You can see the 3 products I've worked on over the years. I wrote the book, I created the app, and I wrote the prose for the bulletproof sign. So let me pause here for questions. Let me encourage you, because I'm sharing my screen, I only see a handful of thumbnails, so I might not see you, but there's only 18 of us. So feel free to just unmute yourself and ask some questions.
I have a question about the new sign. The original 3 signs, the first sentence said, "This is where Emmett Till's body was pulled from the river, point blank, period." And the new one says, "This is where his body may have been pulled from the river." What's the background on that change in wording?
That's a very perceptive question. The background is no one really knows for sure. And if you ask Dale Killinger, the FBI agent who knows more about this case than anyone else in the world, he will tell you that sign that you're looking at on the right is in the wrong place. There's a long local tradition that the body was pulled from the water at a place called Fish Lake Landing, something like that, which is about 3 miles downstream from this site, which is at a place called Graball Landing. The story of Graball, like the long story of Graball, is in the conclusion to the book. And it's separated from Fish Lake Landing by about 3 miles. Here's the thing. There's pretty good evidence for both spots. Dale Killinger is convinced that it's Fish Lake Landing, but talk to a lot of local people. There are stories that have been passed on for generations that it happened at Graball Landing. And so on one hand, the evidence is like 50-50. But there's 2 things at work here. First of all, Fish Lake Landing is no longer connected to the river. You know, rivers move over time, and Fish Lake Landing is no longer connected to the river. So if you went there to commemorate Fish Lake Landing, it would be kind of weird, because it would say this is the spot where Till's body was pulled from the water, but there's no water there anymore. Secondly, Fish Lake Landing is surrounded by swamp, private property swamp, and it's for all intents and purposes inaccessible to the public. Whereas Graball Landing is just off this dirt road. And so the commission, the 18 members, really went back and forth on, it was right before this sign got put up, and they really were thinking very carefully about where to put the new sign. And basically they said, you know what, let's just acknowledge the uncertainty, but put it at Graball Landing, both because Fish Lake Landing is inaccessible, it's uncertain, and it's not by the river anymore. And so that's why they chose Graball Landing, and that's why the new sign acknowledges the uncertainty. And honestly, I think that's really responsible as well, to acknowledge the uncertainty. There's a truism among scholars of memory that in many ways, an uncertain past is always better preserved than a sort of past that's nailed down, if only because uncertainty makes people debate things, right? And when people start debating things, they're like using their heads and fighting over it. And honestly, that's when like a memory guy can rest easy, knowing that the past will be passed on, right? Once people start engaging with it, and uncertainty tends to spur engagement. There's a great line from the memory studies scholar named James Young about Holocaust memory. He says, better a forever, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, better a forever debated memory than a single past that gets nailed down and subsequently forgotten. Other questions, comments?
A follow-up question to that. From my knowledge, I might be wrong, but police reports, they generally like put down if there is a dead body where they found the body. I mean, I know now they do, but this murder didn't happen like that long ago. So I know they did still have the same sort of protocol. So if someone were to call and they found the dead body, would it not be written somewhere? Like, that's just what I'm confused about specifically. I mean, is there not any text or any report that shows where exactly he was found, like from police?
There's not anything that would settle the matter definitively. I would refer you to Chris Benson's book that he co-wrote with Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley. In that book, there's a copy of the death certificate, which labels, it chooses one place, and I can't remember what that death certificate says, but it's unclear, and one of the reasons it's unclear is because they're trying to nail down the spot where the body was discovered, which is where the 17-year-old fisherman named Floyd Hodges discovers the body. But then they get in a boat and then they have to pull the body to, essentially they have to choose an old steamboat landing. If you've been, I imagine it's like this in Huntsville too, but if you've been to rivers in Mississippi, you know that you can't just like get in or out of them anywhere, right? Like the vegetation is so thick and so dense that the only way in or out of these rivers is at clearings, and the clearings happen to be at all the places where the old 19th century steamboat landings were. That's why this place is called Graball Landing. That's why the other option is called Fish Lake. They were landings for steamboats. And so once they got the body that the fishermen saw, they had to pull it to someplace to get the body out of the water. And it's that later thing that's under that's up for debate. It's like, where did they pull the body to? And there's no one alive left who can verify this question. In 2006, the FBI did take Floyd Hodges. They said, Floyd, take us to the spot where you first saw the body, right? And so Floyd took him to the spot. The FBI like took their cell phone, like clicked a little GPS marker, and it wasn't either of the two options. Like, it was like, really? Are you sure? Like, no one ever said it was here before, including you in 1955. So the answer is no, there's no definitive legal documentary evidence that would settle the question. It is remanded to competing historical traditions. Anything else? What other questions do you want to know?
I have a question, something that we talked about in class last week based upon a couple of your chapters, was this idea of geographical authenticity. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here with them saying, we don't know, but it was somewhere near here. And since there's so many sites to all of this, what is the value of geographical authenticity as opposed to commemorating something in a place where it didn't happen? I mean, one of the examples I brought up last week, there's a Holocaust museum in Dallas, Texas, thousands of miles away from where the Holocaust actually happened, but it still does some interesting memory work there. So with everything that you've been doing, what do you see as the value of geographical authenticity?
That's a great question. It depends what memory work is for. Truth be told. And I will just say straight up that authenticity, I don't know what that word means. I will say straight up that sort of nailing down the historical record has never been a high priority for the Emmett Till Memorial Commission, right? For them, what gets them up in the morning and what gets me up in the morning and the ethos that sort of drives the app is that we do memory work, not to sort of settle anything in the past, but we do memory work for the sake of social justice in the present, right? And that's why these stories matter. And so with that as our guiding ethos, I mean, that's why the sign, that first sentence, that as one of the students pointed out so insightfully, I have to like get in close to read it. Emmett Till's body may have been removed here, right? May have been. Is that geographical authenticity? Like maybe. I guess it depends who you trust. I mean, I guess it's authentic in the sense that it's true to the fact that there's a debate. But from the perspective of the commission, they're thinking, we don't really care as much about getting the space right. We care about using the memory to do good social justice work. And so we need a spot that's accessible, where school groups can come, where tour buses can get to. And so like for them, the question of authenticity is kind of perhaps one step below the question of usefulness and social justice in the present. I can give you another example of that from the Emmett Till Memory Project. If you spend some time, you'll notice that our app commemorates, the new version that you're looking at here, commemorates 23 sites in the Mississippi Delta. If you read them carefully, you will notice that different stories and sometimes incompatible stories are told at the various sites, okay? Why is that? Well, that's because people in Glendora, the memory sites in Glendora, are incompatible with the memory sites in Sumner. And if one of them is true, the other can't be true. So as like a commission, we were sort of faced with like, well, what do we do with these competing memorials? And we decided in Glendora, we're going to tell the story from the perspective of Glendora, and in Sumner, we're going to tell the story from the perspective of Sumner, right? Here's our hope. And this has caused lots of controversy, both with the Till family and with would-be funders. And I can share some of that with you if you're interested. But our hope is that as someone uses the Emmett Till Memory Project, if you use this on your phone, like you can click on the map, it'll take you site to site to site. It'll give you GPS directions. It'll give you everything you need. But what you'll notice is that as you go from site to site to site, the story changes, right? And that's because, I don't know, maybe geographical authenticity is a good word here. It's because in Sumner, we're being authentic to the stories told in Sumner. In Glendora, we're being authentic to the stories told in Glendora. In Sunflower County, same. Tallahatchie County, same. And we think, I think, of the sort of fundamental instability of the Memory Project, the fact that it does not choose a winner, so to speak, and say, this is the right story. I think of that as one of its great assets, that it will keep people debating, right? It goes back to what I said earlier. As long as people engage with the project intellectually and thoughtfully, the story has a much better chance of being passed on than if I simply like figure out the right story and upload it to an app. Right? I think the one exception to that is the story that we tell at Bryant's Grocery, which from the perspective of the Till family is the heart of the story. And I went through at least 4 drafts of that particular story before the Till family was willing to sign off and say they supported it. So on that sort of Bryant's Grocery story on the app, I mean, when you read that story, you can rest assured that's the story the Till family wants to tell. I thought my original story was pretty good, truth be told, but they didn't, so we changed it. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
You coined this phrase in your book, the ecology of memory, and it's race, place, and commemoration. How did you choose those facets specifically Because in my mind, I saw a lot of like religion flowing through certain decisions and things regarding memory. I'm just wondering how you chose those specific three things.
That too is a thoughtful question. I think the first thing I'd say is that ecology is an open-ended term. I was focusing on three variables of race, place, and memory, but certainly religion plays a role. Certainly, I don't know, culture plays a role. And like some of those things, I don't know, you could probably channel some of those through the category of place. I would say I chose those because those were the dominant factors. It's a very geographically organized book, right? So place kind of came naturally. Race was at the forefront, and then memory studies. I mean, John and I came out of a program that did a lot to sort of immerse us in the memory studies world. And so those three came very naturally to me. But it's an open-ended concept. And the idea is basically that memory is not simply a function of people thinking about the past and passing it down. That what we think of as memory comes from innumerable sources that all play off of each other. It's an entire system, like an ecology, in which one thing impacts everything else. It's a clunky phrase. And I've had moments where I love the phrase, and I've had moments where I regret the phrase. Sometimes I think these stories stand on their own. And the book might have had a wider reach if I didn't try and frame it with this sort of clunky phrase of the ecology of memory. That said, some people love it. The Atlantic is going to run a piece on Emmett Till memory in March, I'm told, and I think it's going to be about the ecology of memory, even as a phrase is going to show up in the Atlantic. So we'll see. I hope that phrase makes it into the story. So yeah, I don't have much more to say on that one.
Well, I have one other question.
Yeah.
We recently had Dr. Jason Edward Black talk to the class about his University of Alabama African American Heritage Tour, and he talked about the things that he was able to do going to see what had happened on campus versus all of the archival work that he had to do and his students did to find out the stories behind and clues. How much do you think of your book or the memory project? How much of it is boots on the ground and how much of it is boots in the library?
Wow, John, that's such a good question. Yes, is a great answer. I mean, I spent a lot of time, the chapter on Ben Roy's service station and Bryant's Grocery, that chapter grew out of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History in Jackson, trying to dig up some records, some grant records. Grant records were an incredibly fecund source of these stories for me. But I will tell you, I only knew to go to the MDAH and start doing archival research because of the boots on the ground work, because I spent time in Money and locals told me, what's up with that store? The Tribbles did this, but it doesn't. So it would never have occurred to me to pull grant records for a service station that had no obvious connection to the Till murder, unless I was already sort of on site talking to locals. And so for me, like, the archival work is key. You can't, like, it gives a sense of legitimacy. And when I go down to Mississippi, one of the things people tend to respond to very positively is that I've gone through the archives and that I'm not just like telling their stories, because like they're like, we can tell our stories just fine, thank you very much. But I've done the extra work that they haven't done of being in the archives, and that's sort of my value added. But I wouldn't know to go to those archives without boots on the ground. I can tell you one other story that sort of shows how the archive and the on-site research really get entangled with each other. And this is about the work that underpins chapter 3. So for years, I was trying to win access to the minutes of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission. And you know, if you've read chapter 3, you know a bit about this history, but they kept these detailed minutes starting in 2006 straight through. And I was having the hardest time, and no one had ever seen them. There was a sociologist very early on who saw like the first few months, but no one had ever seen the entire several-year run by the time I was writing. On one of my research trips, I took a woman out to lunch who was the administrative assistant for the commission, and she kept the minutes. Her name is Martha Ann. And I said, I bought her lunch. I said, Martha Ann, I would love to see the minutes of the commission. And I know you keep them. Would you be willing to share them with me? And Martha Ann said, well, that's not my permission to give. You would need to ask the permission of Frank Michener. And you know Frank from the book. Frank's a colorful character, but his office was right across the street. And so I said, thank you. I paid the bill. I'm like, see you, Martha Ann. Walked over to Frank's office, knocked on the door, and kind of walked into this sort of super gracious office. I think I describe it in the book. It just like streams planter and the gracious living of the white, moneyed old South. And Frank, you know, he wants to tell me about how he worked for Ronald Reagan. He wants to tell me about anything and everything other than the minutes. And so finally, after an hour of listening to him tell stories, I say, Frank, this is great. Can I see the minutes of the Emmett Till Memorial Commission? And he says, well, Dave, that's not my permission to give. You'd have to ask the black co-chair, a guy named John Wilkie. And I'm like, okay, can you give me his number? And Frank's like, no, I'll call him. You take off. And I have your number, and I'll call John. And if I get some good news from John, I'll call you back. And I'm like, no, Frank, I can call him. And Frank would not share John's number with me. And I walked out of Frank's office totally devastated, thinking that's the end of this road. Frank was being polite, but I'm never going to see these minutes. So I get in my car, and I'm driving back to my hotel, which is like 40 miles away, on this 2-lane Mississippi highway. Also, my phone rings, and it's Frank. And Frank's like, Dave, I talked to John. You can see the minutes. And then he gives me an address and tells me to be there at 8:30 the next morning. And I was so excited. I didn't think about anything. I didn't think, well, where is this address? Is it a good idea to just drive to a random address? But I thought all of those things at 8:30 when I showed it, you have to drive through Glendora, which if you've read chapter 5, you know is one of the poorest, most poverty-stricken places of the Delta. And you drive straight out the other side. You drive for miles into the cotton fields on this dirt road until you come to this metal building in the middle of nowhere, which has like 1 or 2 windows, a door with no windows. And so I'm getting out. I'm thinking, where in the world am I? This metal building in the middle of nowhere. I check my GPS, I check the address, it all seems right. So I open the door and I walk into one of the most lush, sort of CEO style headquarters buildings I have ever been inside. We're talking like beautiful, ornate furniture, sort of hunting things on the walls. And at the front desk was, lo and behold, Martha Ann Clark, the woman who I started with a couple of days earlier. And Martha Ann Clark was the administrative assistant for this sort of massive plantation that was headquartered here. And she said, Dave, I was expecting you. And she's like, I hear you got permission to see the minutes. And I said, yes, ma'am, I did. And so she kind of turns around and there's a closet behind her desk. She goes in the closet, takes out these 3-inch binders and says, follow me. And so we walk down to this conference room, and it's a huge conference room, probably like a 25-foot conference table with all these plush chairs around it. She sets the binders on the table. I'm setting up my little tripod because that's what I do. I have this tripod that takes pictures of everything. And I start to open it, and she puts her hand on it and says, wait, you can't open that yet. I'm like, come again? And she's like, John Wilkie, the chair of the commission, he's gonna come over this morning and talk to you. And if he says it's okay, then you can look at him. I'm like, okay. So John gets there 10 minutes later. And in a Southern accent so thick, I can barely discern it. He says, it's great that you're writing about us, Dave, and that's fine, but I want to know what have you done for us? And how does your project help us? And the timing was really good because just a month or two earlier, the Emmett Till Memorial Commission had won a $76,000 grant from the IMLS. And I was able to say, Mr. Wilkie, you know that $76,000 grant you just won? I wrote that for you. And he just looked at me. He's like, you wrote that grant? Yes, sir. And he just pushed those binders over in front of me. He's like, you can have whatever you want. I like to tell that story because that's a great, I don't know, it just captures the way that, to use John's phrase, boots on the ground and boots on the archive get sort of totally entangled together. If I did not have relationships, I would not have known of that archive. If I wasn't on the ground sort of writing grants for these people, even if I knew of the archive, I wouldn't have been able to access it, right? And so everything sort of conspired to get me access to those binders. But the story doesn't end there. As soon as Mr. Wilkie leaves, I pull the 3 binders over and Martha Ann takes one of them back and she says, you can't look at this one. And I'm like, and of course, as soon as she says that, I'm like, well, that's the one I want to see. And she says, well, those 2 are the official ones. This 3rd one is just my personal sort of responses to what happened. You can't see it. And so I said, okay, I spent the next few hours around that table taking pictures. I take off, I leave. And that was in the summer, I think summer 17, I'm not quite sure. I go back for the Christmas party that the Emmett Till Memorial Commission was hosting down in Mississippi. And, you know, there's all this stuff going on, I'm talking to people. And as I'm walking out, I bump into, of all people, Martha Ann Clark. And she's had a little too much to drink. This stays between us. She's like, Dave, how come you don't come see me anymore? And so I just said, Martha Ann, you don't let me see that 3rd binder. Can I see the 3rd binder? And she's like, well, you come back and I'll let you see it. And so I fly back to Kansas. And then the next summer, I land in Jackson and I have a few hours until my first thing. I don't even remember where I was going, but as soon as I landed, I called up Martha Ann Clark, said, Martha Ann, I got a couple hours. Can I drive up and see that 3rd binder? And she says, sure, Dave, come on up. So I come in, I go back to that same building in the middle of nowhere, walk in, sit down with Martha Ann. And she's like, now, why are you here? I'm like, well, we just talked about it. I'm going to see the 3rd binder. And she said, there is no 3rd binder. And like, I was so confused because I had seen the 3rd binder and we had just talked about it on the phone a couple hours earlier. And I was trying to like be as polite as I could. And I'm like, well, maybe I'm misremembering, but I really thought there was a 3rd binder that I wasn't allowed to see last summer when I was here. And she just keeps making small talk about her daughters off at college. And finally I said, okay, Martha Ann, if there's no binder, I'm taking off. And she, I don't really remember how this happened, but she just kind of gets up, walks back, gives me the 3rd binder and says, sure, you can look at it. Now I was so excited when I walked back to that same conference room to look in that 3rd binder. I thought I was going to find all these kind of smoking guns and dramatic stories of racism and oppression and what have you. And truth be told, that stuff wasn't in there. It was a very valuable binder in that it put names to a bunch of arguments that were just kind of randomly, like the official minutes would say something like, it was argued that X or Y should happen. And in the 3rd binder, Martha Ann's notes, it said like Jerome argued that this should happen. So I was able to, like, by sort of reading them side by side, I was really able to figure out who was doing what. But in some ways, the story of finding the binders is a more dramatic story than what's inside the binders themselves. But it does. I mean, you've got to do archival work and you can, but I mean, is the sort of headquarters of a plantation, does that count as an archive? You kind of got to expand the boundaries of what counts as an archive as well. And you'll only do that from kind of doing the sort of hard work of boots on the ground. What else? Other questions? John, remind me of our time. I'm trying to think what else I should share here.
We have
When are we
about
done?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. What would you like? Would you like I could give you more pictures of like Bryant's Grocery and Ben Roy's and that whole drama. Or I could tell you, kind of give some more background on vandalism, the lessons of the vandalism, current things I'm thinking about vis-a-vis that stuff. Do you guys have a preference?
Well, one thing that we read in your book the other day that I think would be worth hearing you talk about is how memory in media works. So, like everything you're doing with the digital project, that's making things accessible in ways that they haven't been before. And over the last, 20 years since both of us took that public memory class with Brown, there's been so much more done online as commemorative works, trying to do the work that was formerly regulated to museums and monuments where you'd have to go and physically encounter them. So, especially since you've been part of creating online content, can you talk about the value of that as commemoration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's the future of memory in a lot of ways. I will just say that, and I think this will surprise no one, but electronic commemoration apps, websites, I mean, they're not a panacea, right? In some ways, I think the fundamental issue, what's at stake in memory work, is the issue of storytelling, right? Who's going to tell the stories? Whose stories get told? And what are the resources we have to tell them? And what technology does is it kind of blows open the resources. We now have more ways of telling a story. We have ways of reaching new audiences. But it's not a panacea. So one way to get my head around this is to just think about the Emmett Till Memory Project. Like, in a lot of ways, like, the coolest thing about digital, we turned to digital media because people were shooting our signs, right? And so we're like, okay, let's make an app. And then we've run into a lot of problems. Like, all of a sudden now, people across the country are using our app, which is great, right? We've like dramatically expanded our reach. But at the same time, you don't need to be a media studies scholar to know that digital media reproduces some of the same exclusions that characterized older forms of media, right? It happens to be that the Mississippi Delta doesn't have great internet service, right? And so sometimes it's hard to load the Emmett Till Memory Project in the Mississippi Delta. Like, what's going on? Or get this, we hired a consultant to help us review the Emmett Till Memory Project and figure out how we need to make it better. Our audience for an app skews 60% towards people who have a graduate degree, right? That's not the audience we're trying to get, right? And it skews white as well, which is embarrassing to us. And so at the moment right now, we're in talks with a number of different people saying, look, we have this cool digital project, but despite the fact that it's digital, it still skews towards the hyper-educated, and it still skews towards the white hyper-educated. And that's not what we're after. So we're trying to like, okay, digital, just being digital didn't solve those problems for us. So how can we sort of begin to rethink digital technology? And so, I mean, that's where you get moves, and like, you see moves towards minimal computing now that sort of minimizes the computing power needed to tell any story, to make those stories more accessible. We have lots of conversations about, do we just need to add more bells and whistles? Like, if we add more like augmented reality, is that going to like sort of bring in more people? We don't know. And if I could speak for the commission, of which I'm not a part, I'm just an advisor to them. The commission is kind of ambivalent about digital technology. They are strongly committed to storytelling, and they want to tell their stories as wide, with as much power and as much sway and as much reach as possible. And they have turned to digital technology not out of any love for digital technology, but just because it seems like a sort of useful function here at the moment. So yeah, I think that's the best I can do, unless someone has a follow-up on digital technology.
Well, it's interesting to think through, especially with the access part of that, and how digital technology can bring the story to those who don't have the ability to go to the physical places. But then, like you said, it may not be reaching the people in the places that are most affected by the story.
So, I mean, in my life beyond the world of Emmett Till, I'm also leading a project here at the University of Kansas called the Stories for All project. It's an explicitly digital storytelling project. It combines 7 storytelling projects that are located on campus, led by professors, myself included. But it also includes 17 storytellers from across the region, from Kansas City, Lawrence, Topeka, and Wichita, all the major metro areas in our region. And what all 24 of those storytelling projects have in common is they're all digital, and they're all committed to social justice. And we have made a commitment among the 24 of us that we're going to spend 3 years together just kind of thinking about what are the resources that digital technology can bring towards the question of storytelling and social justice. So the Emmett Till Memory Project is part of that. We just kicked ourselves off. We just had our first meeting last month. So we're at the sort of very front end of what will be a 3-year, ongoing set of meetings on digital storytelling and social justice. So perhaps in 3 years, I'll have a better answer for you, John.
All right. Well, are there any other final questions for Dr. Tell? All right, then. Thank you very
my
much
pleasure.
for all of this. It's a lot of information that puts things that we're reading in the book into context, and kind of peels back that curtain to see behind the scenes of the entire process that led to this, as well as what the book is doing and what you're trying to do with all of your work. So this has been very enlightening.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. This is the fun part of my job. I'll just close by saying I'm here, I'm accessible. If you have, this goes not just to John, but to all of you. If you guys have questions or comments or thoughts, look me up, send me an email. I love talking about this stuff, and I will tell you, you have one of the best stories ahead of you still in chapter 5.
That's the chapter we're reading for Wednesday.
Oh, it's good. It's heartbreaking, but it's good.
All right. Well, we appreciate your time, and I'll stick around if any of the students have any questions for me about proposals or anything else like that. But if not, I will see you all Wednesday when we will talk about chapters 4 and 5.
Sounds good. Thank you, John. See y'all.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you.